long time in the making, lots of emails back and forth. So it's great to be tiny little squares on the screen instead of just words. Ruben and I began kicking this idea back and forth when the conference initially was announced. And I asked him, hey, do you want to do something real gay together at MAPC?
Yeah, of course. I was like, hell yeah, let's get MAPC. Let's do it.
Queer archives was the natural topic as it had been an ongoing conversation between us. Ruben was teaching a course centered around queer archives and knew that my work revolved around these ideas, and we'd been exchanging readings and chatting about them.
These conversations became about shared excitement, but also our own desire to see the discourse around queer theory, archives, and print come together.
As a printmaker, I have a real love of printed ephemera and material, of stuff. Digging through archives, holding something held by countless others over time, it feels to me like a way of closing the gap between us. I didn't learn about queer history, especially radical queer histories, in school, and rummaging through archives makes me feel connected to a past that I didn't know existed when I was growing up, a past that would be lost to us if individuals hadn't decided these objects and these stories were worth saving, and eventually donating them to the small institutions that now house queer archives.
Archives and collections had never directly featured into my own work. However, I myself had been really obsessed with objects that clued me into some kind of past. I love the way that material tells stories, revealing something about people and places. Queerness as an overall idea, it totally uproots and shifts normative publics, creating new counterpublics that question and critique dominant narratives of society. Queer archives and the preserved counter-narratives from the past become sites for contemplation, feeling, and potential. These objects direct us to alternatives that we may have lost, forgotten, or never knew. These past moments come into an anxious present, becoming platforms for what Jose Esteban Munoz calls the then and there of a queer futurity.
In conversation with Sharon Hayes, Julia Bryan Wilson wrote, "For documents and images to be stored in an archive or to continue to circulate through time, someone has to want to see them and save them. Recovering a photograph from a dusty box is thus an act of desire. I think desire lines are ones we can trace through Ruben and my work, as well as our amazing panelists here, even as some of them are rightly critical of the archives they work with. In my own work, I tend to be somewhat ahistorical, mashing things from different times and place together to see what kind of conversations can be had. This is a lithograph featured in the members exhibition, printed by Normal Editions Workshop, and is an example of how I've repurposed flyers from gay dance parties from different times and places that I found in archives. This piece is about a desire for connection between the people at the dances themselves, and then in the act of bringing them together, and of course my own connection to them and the histories that they carry. This is another piece, a large drawing. The text comes from a Lesbian Avengers flyer from the 90s, a phrase that kind of got stuck in my head until I repurposed it and adapted it into my own material and aesthetic language of faux fur.
As part of my own work, I produce etchings about intimacy and desire. I love how the etching process allows me to capture a fleeting moment and molding it permanently into a copper plate and then produce a document of continued feeling and memory. This print also featured in the members exhibition as part of a series imagining the space and texture of physical desire. My work has always been about recording my life. As a kid, I was obsessed with photographs. I used to comb through my family's photo albums to discover details about, just who are these people, who are they? Like, I live with them, but I don't know anything about them. And I loved the little details that I would get out of these awkward, strange memories. These little bits and pieces of past lives filled me with curiosity. What is documented, however banal, and what can be learned from these fleeting moments? As I began sharing a space intimately with another person, I began documenting the evidence of our bodies. These photographs have generated works like this large etching exploring ways that the couple is suggested through objects and materials. I believe we are always actively creating our own archives.
Ruben and I talked a lot about what Heather Love calls the emotional rescue, a desire to frame the past through our own contemporary lenses. He said it became a common refrain in the course he taught, with students asking, "Are you trying to emotionally rescue this text right now?" I don't know if Heather Love is so much warning against this as she is calling for us to recognize that this is our own desire at play that we project onto the past. I'm interested in how this desire to commune with our archives, to collapse time, manifests in different artists. What was so exciting about this panel was to see the way people engaged with these histories so differently. I think what we have in common is an engagement with desire and identification, whether it's with historical figures, diva worship, cross-species desire. How do we connect with the past that we were told didn't belong to us? We're going to show some quick slides and shout outs of other artists we feel this panel is in conversation with.
So archiving a towering reading list, Demian Diniazzi created this wheat-pasted photograph to assert their own being as a queer Indigenous artist as monumentally as possible via what the artist calls the radical intersectional queer feminist bibliography. They ask their viewers to hold themselves accountable when they enter the space of the gallery of this particular exhibition and confront the work that is necessary of them.
Sharon Hayes asks us in her series, In the Near Future, what it means to take an object of protest from the archives out of context. What does it carry with us? What is lost to the past?
Emily Lombardo creates printed works that appropriate iconographic signs and symbols of gay liberation to propose new epic monuments. In this series of lithographs titled Queer Monuments, Lombardo's images feel like holy testaments etched into stone and placed on this earth by some alien but fabulous spirit to be worshipped.
Cheryl Denier in 1996 created the film Watermelon Woman, in which a fictional Cheryl seeks and finds information about a Black lesbian actress from the Harlem Renaissance and gives us glimpses into a convincing photo archive that was in fact entirely fabricated by artist Zoe Leonard. Denier imagines a world where marginalized histories were better cared for and grants us permission to invent our own archives when we come up empty-handed.
Jamie C. Knight's prints reference not just queer art of the past, but also objects from a queer and alternative public consciousness. The subject of disco and disco balls in these works conjure the ecstatic hedonism of a night out, while the title of the prints, a reference to a line in the Talking Heads song, Life During Wartime, bring to mind current struggles.
Gabriel Martinez links history and desire through his rich material choices and processes. On the left, we see one piece in a series of protest signs Martinez carves into linoleum and then sands denim over top of, referencing the way men would sand the crotch of their jeans for increased visibility. On the right, hankies are etched and mounted together to tell a larger story.
So lately, my mind has been on what a queer future looks like. How can there be any kind of optimism for a future when today feels so bleak? I keep returning to Sarah Ahmed's 2010 book, The Promise of Happiness. Writing about topics ranging from the tropes of the unhappy queer in films and feminist killjoys, it's a chapter on a happy future that's always captivated me. She writes, to recreate a ground is to deviate from a past that has not been given up. When things go astray, other things can happen. We have a future, perhaps. We might remind ourselves that the perhaps shares its with happiness. The happy future is the future of the perhaps.
The Queer Archive continues to grow. The artists we selected for this panel demonstrate exciting interventions, interpretations, revisions, and recontextualizations that guide us toward the queer tomorrow Ahmed refers to. They demonstrate just how queerness constructs new public spaces of being, and we are so excited to introduce them to you today. Bryce Peterson's work gives us a glimpse of an individual queer experience and encounters with media and pop culture, in which the Queer Archive models a way to envision being.
Through her expansive mural project, Meander, Veronica Cecchi builds and expands queer community around the archive. Collectively, we can envision new ways of seeing the past and contribute new materials to join the growing archive.
Vanessa Adams and Mary Tremonti's Queer Ecology Hanky Project invites individual interpretations around what queer encounters happen in nature or have yet to happen. Riffing off of the archival queer language of hankies, the Hanky Project forms community in our queer present and future as they travel in exhibitions, on bodies, and in fundraising projects.
These documents and records can even point us towards further understanding the land that we stand on and what stories might not be housed physically inside of an archive. What if we began to envision the land as its own archive? Corinne Teed's work poses these and other questions.
Each of our artists present their own expansive utopic view of a queer future infused by a queer past. With that, we're thrilled to introduce our first panelist, Bryce Peterson. Bryce Peterson is an artist and librarian based in Philadelphia, whose work examines the limits of nostalgia and queer identification with mass culture. He has an MFA from Cornell University, an MLIS from Drexel University, and has been a resident at the Mosaic Project in Anderson Ranch and an apprentice at the Fabric Workshop and Museum.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I want to start off first and foremost by expressing some special thanks to Ruben and Amy for organizing this and for keeping this panel afloat during the past few tumultuous months, to say the least. And I have to acknowledge personally, how much of a bright spot this panel has been for me, because it's admittedly been kind of hard to be enthusiastic about making work right now when, an individual studio practice can feel kind of insignificant in relation to the problems our society is facing. So I just want to say I want to, express a degree of solidarity with any of you who are feeling the same and who've been struggling as well in your studio practice. So I thought framing my talk today with the movie Death Becomes Her would be a kind of helpful way of introducing some of the ideas that have long fascinated me and occupied my practice. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the movie, it centers on two longtime rivals played by Meryl Streep and Goldie Hawn, who gain access to eternal life and eternal youth in their respective quests for revenge on each other. And then over the course of the movie, they end up, mutilating each other's bodies and alienating the only man, played by Bruce Willis, who's a sort of plastic surgeon turned undertaker, the only one who's capable of putting them back together. So for a bit of context, I was born in 1989 and this movie came out in 92. So by the time I became familiar with this movie as a child, it was already, in the discount bin at Blockbuster Video where I first found it. And, for whatever reason at the time, I was attracted to the cover. I guess you can see it's a pretty appealing cover. And I convinced my mom to buy it for me from the bin at Blockbuster. And that's probably when she first knew I was gay, honestly. But it's really been one of my favorite movies ever since. And there are three things about it and my relationship to it that I think help frame my work and what I'm interested in. So first and foremost is this sort of chance discovery of a legacy media format. I stumbled on this VHS at a Blockbuster Video, and I think about the ways in which we're kind of stumbling on media artifacts today on the internet, through streaming services, etc. Two, I think, would be the retrospective queer reading of it as a text. So to look at it for its diva narrative, to look at it as an artifact of camp. It has become a sort of like camp underground gay cult classic. And to go back and do a reading of this text, critically and maybe a bit reparatively as well. And then third, there's this aspect in the narrative of the movie itself of a kind of resurrection, or really a zombie narrative of persisting past your expiration and continuing on into some state of decay. And I think of that obsolescence as a potential metaphor for the archive, and from there to look at the archive as a kind of repository of a culture's values. You know, the things that are valued are treasured and are remembered, and the things that are not valued tend to fall by the wayside and to be left behind. So, you know, throughout much of my work, I've sought to recover and re-examine other media artifacts and celebrities from my youth to basically better understand why I was attracted to them in the first place. So this includes, especially lately, Angela Lansbury and Murder, She Wrote. I made a lot of work about Murder, She Wrote. The Golden Girls, individual celebrities like Carrie Fisher, and some others. And I've been interested really in how fandom and consumption of celebrity culture have come to be stand-ins or have come to be arbiters in some way for identity. How there is a genuine and valuable sense of belonging that we get from being a fan of a certain celebrity or a certain television show or movie, but also how it's a particularly dangerous aspect of late capitalism, especially as we see with like the proliferation of cults of celebrity today. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. So I think these fascinations with celebrities and celebrity culture have deserved a kind, for me, of retrospective reckoning, of taking a look back at these artifacts of my youth, and doing it in a way that can be both celebratory and self-critical. So in this particular work, you know, the investigation is taking the form of a print-on-demand object, and I've been working with a lot of print-on-demand objects and fabricated and manipulated home decor. So this in particular is a, you know, relatively cheaply printed melamine plate that I ordered online, and it features a still from an Academy Awards ceremony in the early 90s where Angela Lansbury, seen here, is giving Elizabeth Taylor, this glowing figure in the middle, the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Oscar for her AIDS activism. And really what works like these rely on is a kind of massively accessible yet ultimately fragile archive of digital media. You know, think about how quickly a video like this could be scrubbed from YouTube if a copyright claim is made, or, you know, things are going up and down on streaming media services all the time. And in library and archives work, you know, there's this principle called LOCKSS, L-O-C-K-S-S, which stands for lots of copies, keep stuff safe. And basically, the problem is that digital preservation is so difficult because of all these different media formats and file types and software that sometimes the best strategy for keeping something safe or having a copy to persist over time is to just engage in a bit of redundancy and have many copies in multiple places. And sometimes that even means, you know, printing something out and filing it away, even if it was born digital, you know, printing and filing emails, for instance. So I also found that this method of making of print on demand seemed kind of true to a kind of modern production and consumption method, especially thinking about, you know, expressing individuality through these customized, ubiquitous and cheap forms. And for me as an artist, it also involves this process of furiously screen capping and gathering video stills just to find the exact right frame to reproduce and enshrine on an object. So I think an element of taste comes in, which again is a big part of what makes camp, and it plays a crucial part in the selection of these images. And I think it sort of signals values too. And speaking of values, you know, I found this to be kind of emblematic of what I would think is a sort of particularly suburban experience of consumerism, something that is really divorced from production. You know, you're sending your culture away to a lab to be produced and developed. And, you know, it signals this coded set of values and taste, which is, yes, overwhelmingly, I think, white and working class. So in this work in particular, there's this plush fleece minky surface printed with the text, "When did Barbara Eden die?" which is kind of like a sissified memorial plaque, and pathetic in a way because it doesn't even know whether its own subject is in need of memorializing. And, you know, for the record, Barbara Eden is alive and well as far as I know. So relying on images of celebrity as part of queer identity formation is, you know, far from a new phenomenon. You can think back to your early gay icons like Judy Garland, especially. And, you know, I think many young queer people look to what Eve Kosofsky's Sedgwick calls, and I quote, "those objects whose meaning seemed mysterious, excessive, or oblique in relation to the codes most readily available to us. We needed for there to be sites where the meanings didn't line up tidily with each other, and we learned to invest those sites with fascination and love." But I think these connections also engender a distorted sense of temporality, in which queer identity forms belatedly or asynchronously or in retrospect, looking at things that we were obsessed with when we were young. Things that you only realize upon reflection were early signs that you were queer. And I think one thing that's perhaps queer in scare quotes about queer identity formation then it is this possibility of asynchronous belonging, especially as you're looking back at these outmoded but somewhat perpetually accessible objects of popular culture. And I think in a way being what you would call like a Sedgwickian perverse reader of these cultural objects may ultimately enable a more complex and sustaining and transformational relationship to these mass-produced images. So this perpetual access to media enables us to mourn bygone eras and mourn these bygone divas, but also to engage in some, what I think is creative sort of necromancy. So in this book that I've produced called "There Are So Very Few Stars Left," it engages in a bit of both by juxtaposing these manipulated celebrity portraits with appropriated texts from tabloids and online celebrity trivia, and alongside also some collaged elements of wallpaper. And there's a rich history of collage in print media that I don't really have to go into too much, especially this thought of collage as repurposing and giving new life to printed mass media. But what strikes me about digital collage and this digital collecting of images is that it requires no violence really to the original, only a kind of endless reproduction. So in a sense with these images, there's no original for me to refer to, only reproductions of reproductions. So there's less risk of destruction of the original, which I think ironically kind of undercuts the overwhelming aspect and affect of loss and of mourning. And I think print on demand is this idea maximalized, that anything can be collaged onto anything else without risk and without decay and without delay. Here's another image from that book. So the tone of mourning in this book is present especially in references to the deaths of Kirsty MacColl and Carrie Fisher, and most recently Margot Kidder, who died a couple of years ago. It recognizes not only the attachment to celebrity, but also this kind of melancholic lamentation of what I think is a lost or inaccessible queer past. And this, again, goes back to Sedgwick and what she calls the systematic separation of children from queer adults, their systematic sequestration from the truth about the lives, culture, and sustaining relations of adults they know who may be queer. So these women then are not memorialized purely on their own terms, but also for the roles that I think they play as stand-ins for this lost access, as potential mothers or grandmothers, and also possible former avatars of ourselves. This next project, Mina Permet, presents a series of edited and reconstructed letters from the famously reclusive Italian singer Mina Mazzini's weekly advice column that she wrote for Vanity Fair Italia from 2007 to 2015. And this was after years of her not appearing in public or giving interviews. So the letters themselves are these sort of frank and disarming and often philosophical pieces of advice to people of all ages and walks of life. Mina is a huge celebrity in Italy, so everyone wrote in to get her advice. And for this project, I appropriated her responses by subjecting them to multiple stages of intervention and translation, which I thought were highlighting a potential for loss at every stage and questioning the various identities and relationships between the author, the supplicant writing in to the author, and me as translator and intermediary. So initially this process of collecting was a way for me to understand Mina, this larger than life, almost divine figure, and someone who I've been removed in my understanding of from by time. She was most popular in the 60s and 70s. By geography, she's from a different country. By language, all of her songs are mostly in Italian. These letters were in Italian, and also separated by the internet itself, finding these letters after they had already been long published. So they became a sort of window into this like private sacred zone of her thoughts and beliefs. And soon it became apparent that the process of copying and pasting these letters and removing the letters written to Mina was applying even further mediation and potentially further distancing between myself and the woman behind the words. So looking at one of the letters themselves, in their final forms, they are printed on edible wafer paper. I think it's made of rice, rice flour wafers. So something that's often used mostly in cake decorating. So the paper is literally perishable, but importantly, it's fragile, it's brittle, it's very sensitive to moisture and humidity. It has a lot of risk involved in its decay. And because it's edible, it also poses a literal possibility of consuming Mina's words and taking on a part of her. And it's also kind of glossy and a bit unnerving to look at because of its color and its translucency. So it feels sort of like vellum parchment. But for me, it also references the Eucharist and the biblical notion in a way of the Word made flesh. So as I was working on these projects, they sort of coincided with a memoir I came across called Collections of Nothing by William Davies King, in which he writes about his own collecting habit. And he collects things that wouldn't ordinarily be considered trash and refuse, things like product labels from like cereal boxes and crackers and soup cans and tuna fish. And these things that are seen on the cover of the book, those envelope linings from like private security envelopes, he has a massive collection of those. But this collection goes beyond hoarding because all of these worthless or so-called worthless artifacts are carefully selected and organized and treated with a lot of respect. So in a sense, the trash becomes beautiful when it's seen en masse and collected in such a way. And to quote an overview of King's memoir from the book Collage Culture by David Benash, there is hardly an experience, an emotion, a sensibility, an identity, or a desire that is not somehow enmeshed in the relentless necromancy of the commodity, pulled down to earth and given a concrete form. So this leads me to the final project I wanted to discuss today, which is ongoing and still evolving. It's called 6151 Richmond Street, which is an archive of these transition establishing shots from the Golden Girls. So, every time the scene changes from, say, their home to the office to the hospital, these are the shots in between those scenes. And so together in sequence, there are thousands of these over the course of 7 seasons of the show that I've collected. And they represent a kind of time passing, and they allow a viewer, I think, to fill in sort of narrative gaps, all punctuated by this return to home, to this like safe place, this place of comfort for me, with my own affection for the Golden Girls. But there are also these fictions within fiction. So it's the same images repeated over and over again. Certain locations are reused, even though they're supposed to represent different places. And in later series, the exterior shots of the house even started to be filmed on a replica of the home that was built in the Disneyland lot. And then this house was later destroyed, I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So in many senses, this is a home that can never be returned to, even though it keeps punctuating this sequence. So, for me, collections like the Mina Permet archive of letters and the Golden Girls house images are massive, but they're also strangely, likewise, like non-valuable. It's lots of data, but very little real information. It's the same house over and over again. It's in Mina's letters, it's these garbled words, without context, which aren't really translated correctly and which require a kind of reconstituted meaning. So, for example, this is one final form, potential form, at least for one of the Golden Girls images. It's screenshot 39 from season 4, and it's made into a custom woven blanket. So I sort of view that as an archive of endless reproducibility. So this trove of images that can be returned to and made real and then incorporated back into your actual home and to live with it. Again, to take this digital thing that is fleeting and make it into something cheap but also permanent. And so I envision this archive as something that can be eminently reconfigurable, that behaves differently depending on the circumstances of its presentation. So the images read very differently when they're seen in sequence versus whether they're removed and turned on to different objects and accessed in different ways. So just to sort of circle back to Death Becomes Her and take a bit of a larger view, while I think this method of excavating and critically resurrecting media artifacts is in some ways particularly queer, I think it's by no means exclusive, as a method to queer people. Diva worship in particular is just one way that queer people have sought identity formation and belonging. And even then, I think I have to recognize that my particular emphasis is inherently tied to my, white suburban upbringing. But I think that the archive and the framework I've started to describe here can be a helpful way for all of us in various ways to come to terms with the particular singularity we're facing of, media culture and consumerism and information overload and cults of celebrity that are all, I think, being thrown into starker and starker contrast today. So thank you very much. I look forward to maybe answering some questions later.
Thank you so much, Bryce. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Veronica Cecchi. Veronica is an intermedia artist based in Austin, Texas, where she has been working as a master printer since 2004. She was educated at the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, Kent State, and the Tamarind Institute. Cecchi's culturally conscious artworks have been exhibited continuously for over 2 decades.
Thank you, Ruben. And maybe if you could just leave your microphone on to confirm that everybody can see when I get to that moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Give me just a minute here.
All right.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay. So this is the story of Meander, which is a queer history mural that I did in Austin, Texas. Austin is ancestral Tonkawa land, for those of you who are interested. Before we start, I just want to apologize in advance if there's any barking in the background. If one of my roommates comes home, the dog will bark, and it is outside of my powers to prevent that. So just sorry if that happens. Quick little background and context on me. As stated, I'm Veronica Cecchi. I'm a Tamarind-trained master printer, a retired amateur arm wrestler, and one aspect of building an archive is the gap between your ideal goal and your actual ability to achieve that goal. Simultaneous to working on the project I'm going to talk about, I was also collaborating with Michael Ray Charles on a portfolio, which was like the most challenging project of my career. And I also worked every weekend as a housekeeper at a day spa. So I had these really lofty goals for this project, but because I was working 6 days a week while also doing this project, my ability to reach them was limited. Prior to Meander, I had been experimenting making pattern-based work using pixels and repetition through printmaking, with a result that kind of operates on 2 different levels. You have a square relief block that is its own picture, but each square is a pixel within the larger picture, and then it lines up with the other pixels to make a continuous pattern. This piece is from 2017. It's called Unrequited. It's kind of an early example of my working that way. And I was very eager to push this technique. And in order to make more complex compositions, you need more pixels, so you need bigger spaces to build them on. When I learned that Austin was introducing a new program geared towards fine artists who had not made murals before, I was really excited to apply. I was hoping that if I got accepted, I would get a huge wall that I could just go crazy on with the pixels. And I did get accepted, and that was super exciting. And I went to a meeting, and there were 12 of us, this was the very first year of the program, and they just gave us the address of the wall that we had been assigned. We didn't get to choose our wall. And when I went to check out my wall, this is what I found. It is 4 feet high by 180 feet long. It's a weird shape, y'all, and because it's so short and not a standard rectangle, I knew just right away that my kind of hope of making like a big, complicated, sort of traditional composition was not going to happen. But that didn't mean that I couldn't somehow expand on the way that I had been working using those pixels. And a couple things happened when I went to kind of scope out the space. I brought along a pattern block that I'd been using in a different project and just did a little test to make sure that I could actually print directly onto the wall and that would be legible. From far away, it's supposed to be kind of a heart shape, and then up close you can see the smiley faces. And because this was a project sponsored by the city, I was required to hold a meeting in the community to see what they might want from a potential mural, to give them the opportunity for input. So I went to scope it out. I was also just trying to see who was around there, like who was I going to invite to this meeting, maybe where can I have it? And it was literally across the street from the Austin LGBT Chamber of Commerce. And I thought to myself, I bet they have a conference room or something that they'll let me hold this meeting in, because I am also queer, so they're part of my community. So I went to the LGBT chamber and they were happy to let me use their conference room. And I made this flyer. I love to do DIY flyers just with Sharpies and tape. And I went literally door to door, house to house, into all the businesses kind of near the mural site, handing out this flyer and inviting people to that meeting. And because the meeting was happening at the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, their logo was on the flyer. And because that logo was on the flyer, it signaled to the people I was talking to that it was okay for them to be out with me. And because of that, I was frequently encouraged to create something to celebrate the queer community. This area was a neighborhood and I had no idea. Like, I ran into so many people who shared some aspect of my identity, and it was sort of like a subconscious circle. You know, I initiated that conversation by having this logo on the flyer, and then the people reflected back to me their support for that. So another aspect of building an archive is figuring out the parameters of what it will contain. And my plan was for the pixels that would make up the larger picture to be portraits of queer people. I knew that, you know, I had this fantasy of having every queer person in America on there, but there wasn't time or physical room for that. So I had to sort of make choices about how am I going to narrow the scope of what this will include. Personally, I'm really interested in people who were active in politics or maybe lawsuits, which is one of the main ways that our rights are advanced, is through the courts and the law. I'm also really intrigued by people who are from further back in time and maybe were not able to be out during their lifetime, or were out in a time where it was just straight up a crime to be any version of queer. And I also decided to prioritize, but not be exclusive, about people who had a relationship with Texas, emphasizing Austin specifically. When people think of Texas, they think about brisket, they think about cowboys, they think about high school football, conservative politics. They forget that there's queer people who live here, and there is a lot of us. Being queer in the South is a very weird kind of concurrent invisibility and hypervisibility. Outside of our region, the prevailing attitude is like, oh, well, there's no queers in the South. Why would they want to live there? But within our region, we stand out like a sore thumb, and sometimes, you know, to the point of danger. The combined factors of the unexpected shape of the wall, the really tight schedule that the city held us to. I had just 3 months from being assigned my wall to finish the project, and my intense work schedule, it made figuring out this overall design really challenging. But this is what I came up with. It's a palindromic pride rainbow with the additional black and brown stripes to honor the people of color in our community. And within each color stripe was a symbol made out of those pixels, to which I had assigned a very specific meaning. And even though the shapes were small, it still allowed me to kind of experiment with that technical innovation, which was, you know, in the beginning, my whole reason for applying to the program, which was to create larger shapes out of smaller pictures via printmaking. And I was getting pretty metaphysical with it. Like, I was fixing to cast a spell of protection over all the queer people in Austin and just be like, if you're here, you're safe, we love you. And it felt very powerful to me. And this design was approved by the Department of Art and Public Places, which was one of 2 governing bodies that was going to review it. So all along, I had planned that the portraits, which would be within those pixels, carved by me and some great artists that I knew personally, would exist alongside portraits of people who lived in Austin right now. Because queer people, we're not separate from everybody else. We are part of your larger community. We're wholly integrated. And also, this way, I was kind of like tricking all the straight people into having a sense of ownership and protectiveness about the mural because they would also be represented there. So because I had that approval from Art and Public Places, I felt comfortable starting to hold free community workshops for neighborhood folks, queer or allies, to come and contribute portraits to the mural. I got a little bit of press in the Chronicle, which is our alternative weekly newspaper. I was interviewed on the radio, and I made another wacky flyer. The turnout was really great. Most of the participants did self-portraits or portraits of each other. We held the classes at a senior center, which was just down the road from the mural site, and a lot of grown children came and did portraits with their elderly parents. A lot of people chose to memorialize someone, which had not occurred to me as a possibility, but it was really moving that people took this project I put together as an opportunity to create a remembrance of someone. And at all of these events, I provided everything, the carving tools, the ink, paper, pencils. I taught them start to finish how to do the process, and they could print as many impressions of their block as they wanted, but they left the blocks with me. I also did an event with the Gay Straight Alliance at the Round Rock High School. Round Rock is just the suburb north of Austin, and we guided the students through a queer history lesson. I had just a stack of pictures just with a name on it, no identifying information. And I told the students, just pick a picture of someone that resonates with you. And then they had to Google their person and teach everyone else in the GSA who they were and carve the portrait. And so we got 16 different portraits just from that meeting. So at this point, I was 2.5 months into the project. I had done so much advertising. I had so many people and organizations invested because they had contributed their own labor. And there was a final level of review to go through, which was the City Arts Commission. And at that review, there was intense back and forth. And the end result was that the Arts Commission voted for a redesign. I was given 2 weeks to come up with a completely new design, re-present it to the Arts Commission at their next meeting, or just completely abandon the project. And I'm not gonna lie, y'all, I had like a little breakdown. I stayed home and cried for like 24 hours. I was just so attached to this specific way of doing things and had already put so much work into it, but quitting the project was not an option for me because of that level of community investment that already happened. And it was really unexpected because up until that review, I had been getting just nonstop approval and encouragement. And besides being unexpected, it was confusing, you guys, because within the Arts Commission, there were different reasons why they rejected my design. One of the commissioners argued that it was too overtly queer and it might offend some of their constituents. They were so slick about it. They were like, oh, I'm fine with everyone, I'm welcoming, but I was voted to represent the entire city and we have to consider those who don't agree with this lifestyle. Oh, it triggered me. But then on the other hand, a different commissioner wanted to have more conspicuous inclusion of the transgender community. So although within the blocks themselves, I had a really high percentage of trans-identified people, that particular commissioner thought that it didn't come through in the larger design. I had incorrectly assumed that the rainbow kind of overtly included everyone, but I should have been thinking about the trans community in a more purposeful way. I want to apologize for that. It was a mistake and it's not one that I've made since then. But that was my mandate from the Arts Commission, 2 weeks to come up with something new that was not too queer, but also emphasized the transgender community. Eventually, I came up with this design, which was approved. It's called Meander, which refers to the wandering paths by which we find ourselves, and it's also the name of the pattern on it. In the background is that original palindrome kind of expanded rainbow flag, and then inside of the keys are colors from various pride flags with a portrait printed just in the corner of each key. That call to signal specific inclusion felt to me like it needed to be expanded a little, not to, emphasize one group of people and ignore others. So I called on a variety of pride flags, and deciding which flags to include was another consideration of the archive that I had to work through. Every archive is a container with walls, and maybe you want to put everything into your container, but it's not all going to fit. And once I landed on this pattern, there was a lot of literal math that went into trying to figure out which colors could fit, and if I felt I was representing a broad enough cross-section of our community. And it did hurt me to let go of that other design. There are aspects of it which I still feel are like just more successful than this version. But once Meander got approved, I was ready to roll. I hired a lovely woman named Amy Polivka, who's a student at Austin Community College, to assist me. And we worked together to paint the design and to print the blocks directly onto the wall. So printing onto the wall was not 100% successful. I have since had really good success printing on walls. I have figured it out. But this was 2 years ago, and it was the first time that I had done this on concrete. Looking back, I would have liked to put down a slip coat first. That wall was just weathered by time. It was covered with lichens, and it had these huge pits in it. And I spent 4 days trying to get it as smooth as I could with different fillers and coats and stuff. And I did the best I could with the time and budget that I had. There's certain portraits that look great, and there are other parts of it that are really janky. I did the best that I could. And this is probably the aspect more than anything else that gets to me, is that so many people put work into this, and I was not able to fully express the work that they put in due solely just to the texture of the wall. Here is the completed mural on a beautiful sunny day. So I made it through. I made this mural. It exists. I'm very glad for it. But I wasn't able to do everything perfectly. There were just so many things I wanted to accomplish with this one art piece. And I'm sure, we're all creative people, and we face similar challenges where you just can't put all your ideas into one thing. Like an art piece is another type of archive. It's a house for certain ideas, for certain inspirations, but not all of them. There's a lot that when I think about this piece, I wish that I had had more time to kind of work out. So I'm proud of what I accomplished, but I'm also kind of dissatisfied. This is The Mood from Sunset, a nice romantic version. I was able to, in a different piece for a private client, use the same set of blocks to create something closer to my original vision. You can see in this close-up that those are the same portrait blocks printed on the wall. And this is an 8-foot by 16-foot piece called Sea Change, S-E-E Change. And this is more what I had envisioned when I initially applied for the program, but was not able to realize. And I've done a few more pieces since this one, printed directly on the wall using pattern and pixel technique, and I get a little bit better at it every time. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Theaster Gates. I'm a really big fan of his. He's a super powerful thinker, great speaker. If you have a chance to see a talk with him, I recommend that you go. And archives are the way that he expresses himself. Like, archives are his art. And in this quote, he's talking about how archives show people what's important. So even though I was not, in my own estimation, able to execute this fully in the way that I wanted to, the fact that it exists at all in a red state is a miracle. It was meant to be a temporary project. That's why they call it Tempo 2D. It was a temporary program up for just 1 year and then painted over so someone else could do a new piece on that same wall. However, 2 years later, it is still right now on display. Art in Public Places had the power to extend the contract by 1 year. They wanted to do it longer, but longer has to be approved by the Arts Commission. And literally tomorrow, I will be presenting this design again, along with a stack of letters of support to the same group of people who I had conflict with, and asking them to keep it up even longer. I'm very nervous about that. If I do get approved, I plan to, at the end of that 5-year extension, propose a sort of refresh. I have some ways I'd like to reconfigure it to be both more structurally permanent and more inclusive. But the first step is just getting a yes on that 5-year extension. So fingers crossed on that. And that is the end of my presentation. I want to give a shout out to Kent State University, my alma mater, and thank you for all the work putting this together. I can't imagine how it was to have to shift midstream and do all this. And also to Ruben and Amy for hosting the panel.
Thank you, Veronica. That was incredible. Up next, we have the Queer Ecology Hanky Project. The Queer Ecology Hanky Project is an exhibition of nearly 100 artist-made bandanas exploring the theme of queer ecology. It has been exhibited at The Future, Minneapolis, Irma Freeman Center, Pittsburgh, and Women's Studio Workshop in Rosendale, New York. It is organized by Pittsburgh-based printmakers, Vanessa Adams and Mary Tremonti.
Great. Thanks so much, Amy and Ruben and Bryce and Veronica. It's really inspiring to see all this work. We will give her. Oops. All right.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vanessa Adams, and I'm here with my fellow presenter, co-curator, and co-organizer, Mary Tremonti. We are the organizers of the Queer Ecology Hanky Project. As queer printmakers, artists, and nature freaks, we began the Queer Ecology Hanky Project as a way to bring together our many interests, inviting artists to explore queer ecology, an area of inquiry that unites the study of biology, environment, and sexuality within a framework of queer theory, has given us windows into divergent possibilities for gender and sexuality, models of resilience and resistance in a world that feels increasingly bleak. In recent years, queers of all genders and proclivities have expanded the definitions of the original gay hanky code, which emerged in the United States in the early 1970s as a means for gay men to subtly communicate sexual desires, to include in our project different bodies, identities, and activities. Mary and I both love designing and printing and distributing bandanas as wearable artwork and as a means to continue queer communication and flagging, of finding affinities with plants, animals, mycelia, and each other. At this point, our project has close to 100 artist participants from across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And the project encompasses and has encompassed 2 different exhibitions, an artist talk, artist art market, a hanky code dance party, and a whole bunch of workshops all centered around artist hankies that explore and investigate queer ecologies. Before we dive into the project and the sordid history of gay hanky code, we're going to give you a little bit of background into our personal art practices. So I'm passing it to Mary.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Yeah, my name is Mary Tremonti. I'm a printmaker, DJ, and educator, and I work a lot with screen printing, especially. I would say the core of my work is about connection. It's about creating experiences and objects multiple that make space for people to find one another and connect with one another. So be that through a dance party or an artist multiple that people can wear and signal to one another. And also in my, my practice as a DJ and as a maker of visual culture intersect with each other. And so sometimes themes from dance parties find their way into print work and vice versa, as in throwing a Queer Scouts dance party about a decade ago and making really simple screen printed badges to give to attendees. This is also a way to me of kind of archiving and documenting these ephemeral experiences of dance parties. And then I made a poster later as like a screen print. And then I also made embroidered badges. And we just continued to kind of reprint, repress these embroidered badges. There's over 6,000 of them out in the world. So really like thinking about signifiers and making objects that allow people to signal to one another. Bandanas are also a piece of that. I've been making animal themed bandanas for almost a decade now. And that started as a really deep nod to gay hanky code and starting with kind of a gay pantheon of, you know, bears and otters, wolves, cougars, etc. And then it's kind of expanded to a yes and of other animals. And thinking about how all kinds of humans find affinity with non-human species and can signal that to one another. The hanky in the bottom right corner there of mushrooms was the first collaboration that Vanessa and I did together. We love to go foraging together, and we kind of hatched the idea for the Queer Ecology Hanky Project on one of our mushroom hunting walks. Passing it back to Vanessa.
Thanks, Mary. Hello again. I'm Vanessa Adams. I'm an artist, printmaker, plant nerd, amateur mycology enthusiast. For the past couple of years, my work has been interested in exploring the life cycles of plants and the phases of the moon as ways to envision and investigate possibilities for the future. So build systems of queer magic into the work and looking for possibilities for healing and regeneration, visioning other worlds with prints, zines, and installations. So this first piece is from an exhibition I did with another friend, Erica Hattori, called Portals. And this is from a series of work. They're sculptural, three-dimensional screen prints that are illuminated. And the series is called How to Regain Sight. Next. This is a sculptural fortune teller piece. That there in the center is a screen printed fortune teller called How to Fall Apart and Come Back Together. And on the pedestal, there's instructions and actual gloves for participants to wear so that people in the gallery could take out the fortune teller and use it to cast a spell and create a little ritual within the gallery space. Next. These are more two-dimensional print work. 3 Plants for Grief and Heartache, and 2021 lunar calendar from a long series of lunar calendar works. And I envision these both as just tools for personal and collective transformation. Next. Next. Oh, most recently I've been really excited about working in collaboration with other artists. These prints are in collaboration with, oh, you wanna go, there we go. Are in collaboration with my partner, who's also an artist, Andrea Narno. And the project is called Plants from Home, Plantas de Terun, which is a risograph and linocut installation that looks at plants and our plants from our hometowns. Hers, Mexico City, and mine, New Orleans, as a source for healing and grounding across borders and distance, and a place and space for longing and memory. Next.
Great. So yeah, the Queer Ecology Hanky Project is kind of the next collabo that we've done together, and a really deep and large one, working with so many artists, as Vanessa mentioned, from all over this continent. And so we're going to give a really, really brief, super, super abridged just snapshot of some of our inspirations of gay hanky code and other queer hanky projects real briefly. And just to say, the theme of the project is queer ecology, and then the object, the material that of the exhibition and project is these hankies that are already kind of imbued with a queer meaning, like historically and contemporarily.
This part is so much fun. Okay. Well, there's disagreement about the precise exact origins of the gay hanky code. There is agreement that it emerged from the leather scene in the gay leather scene in the Bay Area in the 1970s. So there was like a surging population of gay men, and folks in the BDSM scene started wearing hankies in their back pockets as a way to showcase their desires, to cruise and signal to each other with discretion. And as it rose in popularity, gay bars put out their own hanky codes to patrons. Like right here, you can see the image leather, and here the Boston Eagle has their own gay hanky code. So you can see that it's sort of divided by color, left, right. So different colors and positions signify different desires, like piggy, into bondage, nothing but rimming. And this began in sort of the gay man-centered leather scene, but it spread to kinky lesbian scenes, which we can see. And then it spread also to the broader gay community. But I think an important thing to note about this is, like, while this does represent like actual desires, so much play and humor and tongue-in-cheek in this. This On Our Backs lesbian hanky code, it's sort of like super tongue-in-cheek because it's offered in satin hankies. And there's just a lot of humor in these projects, and a lot of humor and also lots of actual desire. And just as this proliferated, it's really just become truly embedded in the queer lexicon, hankies and the hanky code.
Oops. There we go. And so an artist's take on this emerging coding was Hal Fisher's Gay Semiotics, which was a book that he put out in 1977. He didn't, so kind of very playfully, much like Martha Rosler's like Semiotics of the Kitchen, taking this kind of a critical theory framework of semiotics and applying that to his own culture of gay men in San Francisco in the 70s. And again, you know, having this like kind of humor and tongue-in-cheek with it, like as in this photo of the hankies, you know, it says, handkerchiefs are also employed in the treatment of nasal discharge and in some cases may have no significance in regard to sexual contact. So a lot of playfulness in this, but also like documenting gay archetypes of the time. And, you know, Hal Fisher didn't set out to create this straight up photography documentary book of canonizing these archetypes, but in making this work, he kind of did just that. And so we're really interested in this kind of artist take on the culture and how that is a way of kind of archiving and documenting this moment in time. We're also not the only kind of more contemporary artists to make queer hanky projects. This was Lesbian Hanky Panky that was organized in Melbourne, Australia, kind of really literally depicting the activities that each color in the hanky code signifies. So orange being up for anything and green being bootblacking. There's another project out of Philly, and I hope someone in this room remembers who did this because I could not find the artist's name. But again, a hanky code project that really is quite literal about the meaning of each color, and also around the border of each of these hankies, it lists all of the different colors and all of the different activities. And this is again like an expansion from an original 1970s gay hanky code intended for cis male bodies. This really expands who the hanky code is for, who are the queers, and what can they do. Ooh. There we go. Another space contemporarily where we see hanky code in queer cultures in the space of a dance party. And I think this is pretty significant as also as someone who has organized hanky code dance parties, just thinking about the intentionality of that space and what the meaning of that object has in that space versus being out in the street and the so-called straight world, and thinking about how, you know, originally in the space of leather bars, you know, hankies had a very coded meaning, and bringing that back into an intentionally queer space. Oops. Sorry, my computer is slow. And so some of the historical framework that inspired us, and then some of the kind of theory and headspace that inspired us is Bruce Bagamill's Biological Exuberance, as well as, I hadn't read the book Queer Ecologies, but I read a lot of essays on that theme, but just biological exuberance is a real paradigm shifter and kind of the lens through which we view animal behavior, particularly like mammals and birds, and you know, really putting a queer lens and an anti-capitalist lens and a take on observing behaviors, and not just sexual behaviors, but also social behaviors of how animals form communities and interdependence. So these were themes that really inspired us in putting out the call for the Queer Ecology Hanky Project.
Yeah, I think we were just really excited to bring that energy of queer ecologies to the Hanky Code because, you know, in some ways, the original Hanky Code, gay Hanky Code, was all about categories, you know, top, bottom, submissive, dominant. But we were just excited to bring some of the queer ecology energy to sort of disrupt and break down those binaries. And I think something that's pretty cool is that we channeled a lot of the energy of sort of like energy and ideas of queer ecology into putting together the Queer Ecology Hanky Project, sometimes intentionally and other times less intentionally. Like we put out this, you can see this is our call for proposals that we put out online, and a bunch of different kind of internet platforms picked up and spread the call for proposals. And so we felt like it wound up spreading like in this super decentralized mycelium way, like out to all these diverse networks of people that we didn't know. And so we wound up getting this like really interesting mix of people that were connected to us in some ways, but then also just like a big vast spread, which was exciting to us. And I think that this has really just like imbued a lot of the project. There's just putting out that big vast spread, big vast call, and getting a wide spread of artists to so many different networks has just mean we get like a ton of different artists involved.
Thank you. Yeah, we really strove. I know we only have a couple minutes left, so we're gonna go a little faster maybe, but not too fast. But also just like striving to make this an accessible exhibition and project to participate in. So there's artists with all different kinds of backgrounds and training in visual art. You know, we have PhDs who are in the academy. We have self-taught artists, some people who are very young. And so we also put out the opportunity for us to print some of the hanky designs for people who did not have the capacity or access to printmaking themselves. And so here we see this like really beautiful excess and abundance of queer artists and perspectives on queer ecology.
Yeah, it's like just like a real like multitude of colors, materials, printmaking techniques, approaches to queer ecology. Yeah, and I think some of the artists talk about queer ecology quite directly, sort of like bringing in the principles of Bruce Bagmill, like looking at the long-term same-sex partnerings of albatrosses, and other people really worked on a metaphorical level, bringing in like the femme flagging for plants and things like that. And I think just the wide range of backgrounds, techniques, and materials has just given this a expansive, abundant magic to it, which is really exciting, and just made it like just like Bruce Bagmill, just like Hal Fisher had his own little snapshot of San Francisco. I feel like having this wide spread of queer participants has given us our own little mini archive of our time and our own little archive of what queer community is like. Not that it's a representative of queer community in its entirety, but a representative of some of the shifting, breaking down of binaries, and just sort of what queer culture is like at this moment through the lens of queer ecology. We wanted to show you some of these little dioramas from one of our fundraisers, but also talk about some of the prints individually to give you a sense of what folks are really bringing to their work. This piece is by Georgia McCandlish, and it's called Cackle Queen. And the spotted hyena is center stage in this hanky. The female spotted hyena is the top of the pack, huge, running the show and dominating males. This hyena also has a large, magic, extended clitoris. And in the corner of the hanky, you can see some like fag dyke, some fag dyke erotic encounter happening. And what I love about this is it's both flagging for femme bitch top, and also the artist is flagging for gender nonconformity. Next.
Can you see it?
Nope. There we go.
Um,
Technicals. This is E. Henderson's Seen Unseen hanky, in which sexual desire, flagging, camouflage are on the table. Desiring a queer, gender nonconforming flagging culture, dildos, whips, and floggers are entwined with passion flower vine, showing both possibilities for boldly showing sexual desire, but also the possibility for hiding in plain sight. Next. This is Katie Kaplan's Femme Poison Power, which celebrates the power of the feminine with plant allies. The artist writes, highly decorative and abundant, a dense thicket of plant allies, a spectrum of the elegant, healing, and poisonous, a vibrant antithesis to femme invisibility. Beyond flagging, this hanky sort of speaks to community as the artist envisions people wearing this hanky and sort of taking on some of the vibes of these plants and just really speaking to and feeling the power of feminists when wearing the hanky. Next.
I think there's a lag because I can see it on my screen, but you're not seeing it yet.
This is Eriko Hattori's hanky Soft Touch, which centers around the Joragumo, a ghost from Japanese folklore. This ghost is a shapeshifter, sometimes eating men, sometimes doing good deeds. And Eriko Hattori sort of summons and envisions the Joragumo as a guardian for queer Japanese individuals. They utilize them as a means for them to explore their femininity, the intersection of being queer and Japanese American, and also as a means to envision their own fantasies and realities. Next.
Great. And Anna Wagner's hanky explores like intergenerational queer relationships. Here with this juicy Baphomet representing older generation of dykes, lesbians, nursing tenderly this younger generation hyena, who, as Vanessa mentions, also can represent intersex and just an expansion of gender identity.
And they're surrounded by some like delicious, hallucinatory, and visionary plants. And both of these artists, Devin Cohen and Jack Groves, feature slime molds in their hankies, both because slime molds are like infinite possibilities, because their form is super shifty, but also because slime molds are made up of thousands of tiny single cell organisms that choose to work together collaboratively. So with these hankies, the artists are sort of summoning visions or possibilities of the power and all the things we can accomplish as a queer community when we work together collaboratively.
There we go.
And our last hankies are Claire Ragland and Andrea Narno, and both of these are looking at pollinators. So Claire Ragland's on the left has bats that are pollinating and butterflies and hummingbirds and bees. And this is just sort of about the riot and joyousness that happens when pollinators, like that happens with cross-pollination and how the juiciness that happens and comes from that. And Andrea Narno's features a tiny plant which is pollinated by snails and also agave moths and agave blossoms. And I think what's really the importance of this hanky is the possibilities of interdependence, because all of these species couldn't exist without each other. So I think both of these hankies and the last one's about slime molds and Anna Wagner's are really envisioning futures and beautiful, optimistic futures for our queer communities.
Here we go. So we're at, I know we're at 21 minutes and I want to leave time for Corinne's work. So I'm just going to breeze super quick about, as Vanessa mentioned earlier, we really programmed out the run of the show. We had the space for a month and just had a lot of different types of events and programming, different ways for people to interact with the work and with each other, and really speaking to the variety of ways that different people might want to experience this artwork. So dance parties, workshops. We visited the Fermentation Festival in Pittsburgh and had some fermenty themed hankies. And then and I was just really like grateful to be able to have that space for the month of February and early March, because it was really the last time I was around so many people before everything closed down. So to have those moments in person and moments of queer joy and ecstasy together. Vanessa, do you want to talk about the fundraising, or do you want me to just?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to just breeze through it so we can make up on time? Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. So the fundraiser, just like in terms of all of this like activation in space and the hankies being out in the world with the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings and the movements happening around racial justice, we really wanted to, that feels like a reality of the present moment. And so because we had multiples of all the hankies and many that were left unsold, artists donated hankies, and we did an amazing raffle to benefit two awesome organizations, House of Tulip and Artist Activation, both which are led by Black trans people and benefit and support and celebrate Black trans lives. And we're doing another round really soon, Mary. You want to say about that?
Our next round will be the last week of October until that second full moon on October 31st, and we'll be benefiting two different orgs that are land and housing projects for that center Black and trans queer voices. So Finca Flamboyant, which is in Puerto Rico, and Sisters PGH, which is here in Pittsburgh. So keep an eye out for that on Hanky Situation. And in the future, we will be working on some publications and hopefully can exhibit this project in person again soon. My hope is also that we can add to this collection each time it's exhibited again. Anything else you want to add, Vanessa? I just want to thank everyone so much for your time and energy. Yeah, I really appreciate being here.
Thank you.
Great. Okay. And I'm stopping my share. Thank you all.
Gosh, thank you so much, Mary and Vanessa. All right, thank you everybody for sticking with us. We have one more final panelist with us, and that is Corinne Teed, and I'm really excited to introduce them to the panel today. Corinne Teed is a research-based artist working in printmaking, installation, time-based media, and social practice. Their work lives at the intersection of queer theory, ecology, critical animal studies, and settler colonial studies. Teed collaboratively reimagines interspecies communities in this era of environmental devastation. They currently teach at University of Minnesota. Welcome, Corinne.
Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen share?
We could, but now we can't.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot. Of course. So I'm Corinne Teed, and I am super excited to be here today, and I'm going to try to move quickly since we are running right up against time here. So thank you to everyone on this panel for organizing the panel, for all the amazing presentations that have happened so far. I approach the archives a little differently. I engage with archives that I feel are full of erasures that I do not see myself in, and yet that they're archives that I carry within me due to the harm that they've inflicted. The ways they frame power, the ways they frame human relationships to more than human beings, the ways they frame race, the ways they frame desire, and the ways they frame alienation and community. I want to unpack all I inherited from these archives and upend their implications. So I'm interested in archival interventions as a process of producing counterhistories that interrupt oppressive paradigms and reclaim ideologies that are bent on liberation. Or as Delita Martin said in that incredible keynote yesterday, to recast history, to reshape this present moment. I often engage in these interventions as a collaborative process, one that invites in others to reimagine and rewrite or recast the archival power. So in approaching this work, I use a guide, as a guide, my own process of confronting settler colonial paradigms by learning from Indigenous communities in their ongoing work of decolonizing, especially here where I live on unceded Dakota land in so-called Minneapolis. So this here is the Twin Cities Dakota land map, a reorienting of place and power made by artist Melina Miles, whose Spirit Lake Dakota, Mohegan, and Creek Like many, I'm fortunate to live on this land and for the opportunities I have to both continually learn from the Dakota and Anishinaabe stewards who have caretaken this land for centuries, and also to research the histories of settler colonialism that have shaped contemporary relationships to land, to each other, and to more than human communities. These engagements and research are more explicit in some of my more recent projects, like Theraphobia, an animation project looking at the history of wolves in North America, that uses archival materials for the animation and a constructed soundscape with interviews from Bob Shimmick, an Anishinaabe or Ojibwe wolf protector, and Christina Eisenberg, a settler-descended wolf biologist. Or here in the project Amongst Relatives, a book I wrote with excerpts from interviews I conducted with experts on Indigenous relationship with plant species. The interviews were with Frances Batiyoun, a Lakota caretaker of the Native American Medicine Gardens, and Rhonda Funmaker, owner of Indigenous catering company Invictus, an avid forager and a knowledge keeper of the Ho-Chunk tribe in now Wisconsin. Both Theraphobia and Amongst Relatives are invested in the creation of new archival materials, of collecting oral histories, a common theme in my work. And I joke that I don't see myself as a queer separatist because I see my future, my community, and my projects as bound up with so many, not just queer people. But since this panel is focused on queering the archive, I'm going to focus on the work that is more engaged with queer ecologies in queer interventions on the archive. So for Mapping the Burrows print series, I did research at the North Dakota State University archives and their geology texts. These texts included diagrams attempting to measure, standardize, demarcate, and control landscapes for technologies of extraction, ideas fleshed out in incredible ways in the contested landscapes panel yesterday. This research into geologic diagrams led to the Mapping the Burrows print series. For these prints, I intervene on geologic diagrams to re-envision human relationship to the landscape, placing collected photographic portraits of queer participants embedded. While I utilize the archive of Western science that maps one particular version of geologic history, I interrupt it through an intervention that places queers within the earth, occupying the dwellings of other species, suggesting both interspecies alliances and the possibility of a future emergence onto the landscape. The participatory aspect of Mapping the Burrows occurred while I was at UC residency. Participants examined cross-species intimacy and empathy through an imagined cohabitation of underground animal burrows. And we're just gonna watch, oh, hold on. I'm gonna stop sharing and optimize my video. So hold on one second. That was a still from the video we're about to watch. And I'm gonna share my audio so this sounds better. As research into queer ecology, the burrows features queer participants who are encouraged to explore the pleasures of the burrow, to ground, to sink, to nest, and then to reemerge. While the burrows situates contemporary portraiture within a utopic multi-species community, we also sense a dystopia of being trapped and isolated from each other, part of the tension in this piece. Feral Utopias, a 2015 participatory animation project, also seeks to interrupt colonialist paradigms that we have both knowingly and unconsciously inherited. This project began with research at the University of Iowa Special Collections, looking at 19th century wood engravings by colonial naturalists that were documenting the New World landscapes of the Americas. So I took high resolution scans from the books, or actually the amazing librarians made high resolution scans from the books for me. I gathered together with participants over food and discussed the ways that we have inherited these settler colonial paradigms. The engravings communicated narratives of the sublime, of the white protagonist exploring the terrains of his supposed manifest destiny, full of a wild nature that he was both simultaneously in awe of and desired to sire over, The works often included overtly racist materials about both Black and Indigenous peoples, and included inaccurate depictions of the threats of the natural world that led to mass exterminations and ecocide. Participants in the project each chose a species, were interviewed on their particular affinities for that species, answering the question, what species provides a sense of home to you? And then recorded in physical movements that represented their relationship to that species. The project was presented as a 3-channel animation projected onto the wall. And the entryway into the gallery was through a wallpapered insert. In order to go into the gallery, you had to crouch down, most people, to go under what had become a 5-foot-tall doorway. The insert into the doorway effectively shrunk the entrance so that the audience became keenly aware of entering an alternate space, a world distinct of our own. So we're gonna watch a short of this video, and this is a single channel version here.
Scurry under a rock. Little flashes of blue on her. When you see one, you know that they're female because they've evolved, or some say devolved, into a species that has no male population.
They cross those oceans. They know where home is and they carry it with them. And there's just something about that knowing. It's a compass. It's like an inner compass.
It's more of trying to see examples or make sense of my own presence.
The lion goes across plains and is constantly being strategic and constantly being aware.
Their strength in extreme environments. I mean, in times of extreme distress, their willingness and their ability to just wait it out. The storm's going to pass. The season will change.
I don't want to impose some sort of human value system onto them, but I really am envious of their world without patriarchy and sexual dimorphism. They are whiptail lizards. They are without gender. And I think that's wonderful. Like to just lay out in the sun and not have a gender.
Seeing how natural it is to be sensual and to be sexual, that it's effortless, just being, the actual body moving and rocking as it breathes. It makes you pay attention to what it is to be living, and there's a sense of humility with that attachment.
There's just some comfort in.
I'm going to stop here just for the sake of time with that clip. So as participants explored their personal narratives of cross-species affinity, their stories were located within the struggle of finding a sense of home in a society that has repeatedly communicated to queer people that we are unwanted. The otherworldly space immerses the audience in this multi-voice narrative that reveal utopic cross-species alliances amidst the dystopic realities of America as a settler colonial landscape. This project takes great inspiration from critical investigations into America as a place of settler colonialism, whose history of Native genocide shapes contemporary culture and politics. Through an exploration of the potential for queer and animal alliances, much like Mary and Vanessa were talking about, the work questions with whom queerness is in community and how queerness can precipitate new solidarities. Those who attended the exhibition were invited to take home a letterpress booklet that have further elaborated participants' stories. The piece becomes an archive itself of queer ecology, a collection of unique articulations of empathy for other species, a version of an oral history archive. This work contended with not just homophobic, but also ecocidal, so violent to the environment or more than human beings, and a white supremacist genocidal past. Using the archive itself, it intervened on the archive, recasting history, to use Delita Martin's words again, inserting into the past and present stories of loss, of community, of grieving, and of holding each other up. I'm grateful to everyone who participated in this project, Dwayne, Fidencio, Harper, Vanessa, and Nina, for their vulnerability and critical thought in the work, and for collaboratively creating new archives. I'm going to end with a quote from Elizabeth Pavanelli from her book, Geontologies, A Requiem to Late Liberalism, as she discussed archives as a place that a social otherwise can endure and change existing social formations of power. Referencing Derrida's work, Archive Fever, she writes, "Archival power works against every given archive. It produces or is a compulsion to dig deeper into and beyond every given archive, to dream of a person who will open a wall to an alcove that cannot be opened, so that some final document can be hidden among the infinite library, a document that would decide fate or be the final arbiter of a power that claims to be outside given power, and at the same time, the final and most effective mask of given power." So this quote is a dialectic, and it's a lot to unpack. But what I want to take from it is what Pavanelli points out, that the archive will always fail in fully representing us, creating an ongoing desire to intervene, to rebuild, to expand, or as Martin said, to recast. And in recognizing this lack of the archive, it pushes us to make more collections, to help build liberatory futures that are contending with the violences of the past and queering the future. Thank you. And that is all.
Thank you so much, Corinne. I do understand that we have officially hit our time for the panel, but if you would like to stick around and we can address some of the questions live, you can also submit them to the Q&A and we can do some typed responses. I did, Corinne, since I have you right here and we just came off of your talk, I did want to ask this one question from Denchi that was directed to you. For the video in the burrows, did you instruct what the participants should do within the burrows, or did they interpret the pleasures of the burrows in their own way?
I did not instruct. I tend to not instruct, just provide the platform. So people crawled into a dirt hole that I made with a, it looks like you're seeing it this way, but it was filmed this way. So you're looking from above down, and they were acting like the side of the burrow was ground. That was the one instruction. So one participant kind of just slept in there for a while. She felt really comfortable and was really happy and just kind of napped. And another felt really agitated. And yeah, they all had very different responses to being in the burrow itself.
I can start to field the other question in the Q&A. It says, the idea of emotionally rescuing a text or other work of art is very interesting to me. I'd love to hear more discussion on this. What does it mean to you? And since I'm the one that kind of projected this onto us, I would say that like one person's emotional rescue is another person's reparative reading that Bryce talked about. So to me, it's this sense of like looking at the past and saying, oh, if they had what we have, if they had our current language, they would probably identify this way. And that desire to see things through the way we see them now, when, you know, maybe that's not what the person in the past desired at all. And that like wanting to bridge that gap is kind of how I think of it, but I'd be curious to think, to hear how Bryce interprets that, because I feel like there was a lot of themes in that in your presentation as well.
Yeah, I would say, you know, what I try to do lately is to engage in what there's another theorist has called sitting with a text, as opposed to trying to engage too much in like a reparative reading or a critical reading, to acknowledge a text for what it is, for its shortcomings and its successes, and to engage with it on that level rather than trying to, I think without getting into the sort of, in some ways, I think silly discussion of like stan and cancel culture, whatever that really means. I think we have a tendency to jump to a posture of defensiveness when it comes to things we love, especially as people experience now increasingly works made by problematic people who have done horrible things. And there's a tendency to either want to like burn it all down, which is a tendency I feel strongly sometimes, and also a tendency to like defend with a knee-jerk response. And I think what I'm trying to do with a lot of this older work that comes from a problematic time when there was a sort of monolithic media culture is to just sit with it and take it as it is, and resist any urge to go beyond just engaging with it on its own terms. That's how I'm thinking of it.
Thanks, Bryce.
Mm-hmm.
Another one in the Q&A, in Feral Utopias, I kept looking for the animal or plant that people were identifying with to orient myself. Was that info there?
No. You could find the animal that somebody was talking to very clearly in the provided booklet. The stories weren't spliced together, so it became very clear what people had said during their interviews. But during the actual animation, there was both like, it felt important that there weren't non-human animals in the actual animation, because of sitting with the sense of loss or distance that I think was being communicated well in the stories, or the kind of melancholy of struggling with alienation. And then I guess for me, the sense in the animation of it not being about specific species felt important, but instead kind of looking at the psychological space of queerness and alienation and orientations that we have towards other species, like affective orientations, the kind of like emotional, spiritual sense of connection that people live with, are actually how our relationships to other species make up our identities as much as other aspects of our identities.
Bryce, there's a question in the chat for you, and I'll read it. Bryce, in your work, Mina Per Me, you worked through translating and altering the work, and you also used this approach in Sexy Persons, where you used a Google voice recognition software to translate text into poetry. How do you see this translation and the reproduction of images in relation to your work? Is this approximate or an offspring of the original version from the archive, a queered, or as you said in your talk, sissified version? And specifically in your role as librarian, how do you see the act of corrupting or reconfiguring text in relation to the original? Is this a truer source point to pull from?
Thanks for that question. It's really interesting, and I probably would need more time to think through it fully. I think what I think of the role of technology in some of these works as a corrupting force, and yet a sort of necessary evil. That this technology is how I'm accessing these things that were originally analog and are now in some zombified digital form on the internet, on the web. And I need to use this technology to access it. And in doing so, and in accessing it, I'm kind of corrupting it. Like there's the thought that whenever you open and save and close a JPEG, it gets progressively more and more distorted. And with print materials too, the more they get used, the more they get destroyed. So I think of it sort of in that way, that it kind of highlights for me the pathos of these works, or relatedly, like the patheticness of my attachment to them too, that in holding them close, I'm kind of destroying them.
Thank you, Bryce. And I also just want to say, I mean, we have all of our information here on the screen. If anybody would, you know, definitely feel free to reach out to us. We love engaging in this topic. It's something that Amy and I were really excited to bring to like having larger discussions about. And all of our panelists as well. Thank you so much for sharing what you all do and how you approach the topic. And I just want to give a special thank you to Amy, my co-chair, for keeping me pretty stable, you know, and keeping me like on top of things as well. So I couldn't have done it without you. And I love this little queer community that we've built for ourselves.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. I guess we'll wrap it up here.
Thank you. So there's now a 20-minute intermission. Check out our asynchronous material while you're waiting. And we'll do a little testing. Feel free to keep chatting, but we're signing off. Thank you.
Also keep in mind that this was all recorded, so you can access this recording once it's been made available. Oh my God, Veronica, what is that fan?
It's hot. It's in the 90s and I'm in an attic. That was great, y'all. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your project and being so honest and open about everything. So good. Now's that time where we like all like really like hug, like one big group hug, and just are like, oh my God, someone get me my beer.